All right, well, welcome back to our series on Genesis. We are now in on our next major character in the story, and that is Isaac. And so, we're going to do now. I'm using a new format here so that we can be a little bit more interactive. And I'm recording this on Zoom, so that'll allow me to pull up the Bible and talk to you with the Bible. It'll also allow me to show you some maps and some stuff. And so we're in Genesis. We're going to be in chapter 25. We're going to start in verse 19. And so what we're going to do is just set the table by saying Isaac, even though he is the son of the promised, the miraculous son of Abraham, he's not the most important character in Genesis. His story is very, very brief, and it focuses mainly on a couple of disputes he got into. The biggest character in Genesis, of course, is Abraham. And after Abraham, the biggest character in Genesis is Jacob, the deceiver, otherwise known as Israel. And so Isaac really is a stepping stone to get into the life of Jacob. Now, he's still very important, and his wife is very important. As we're going to see, God is going to speak to her as much as he does to him in the narrative. And just for review, does anybody remember what the name Isaac means? If you said he laughs, that's correct. Yitzhak means he laughs, and it was a play on words because Sarah and Abraham both laughed at God when he suggested they might have a child. So in chapter 25, verse 19, we see these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. See, even there, it's Isaac is Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram. Let me pull up a screen here, and I'm going to show you Paddan Aram. We're getting this set up. Okay, so right here is you can see my cursor over Canaan. That's where Abraham and Isaac were, and then they went up to Paddan Aram, which is in the northern part. They're right against the border with the Hittites, where Turkey is today, kind of up in northern Iraq, near Syria, and there's Haran right near it. And so that's where she came from, where Abraham's family had been. And you can kind of see it was up in the north, and she moved back down. Get back to the Bible now. Okay, so, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. So look, it's the same thing that happened with Sarah. But God is going to do something different here. Instead of waiting until Rebekah is old. It says, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau, which means red. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So we already see that there is a bit of contention here. There's a split over the boys. One parent loves one, the other parent loves the other. And so we're going to get into more stories about them next week when we talk about Jacob and the birthright. Now we're going to skip down to chapter 26, and we're going to cover 3 stories about Isaac. And so I want you to take a moment, pause the video, read chapter 26 about God's promise to Isaac, read about Isaac and Abimelech, remember him from last time, and then read about the wells at the end. And so we'll get to chapter, at the end of chapter 26, we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll continue. So take a break, read those, and we'll come back. Well, now that you've read these passages, what do you think? Isn't it amazing how Isaac is so much like Abraham? God gives him a promise there in verse 1 of 26. There's a famine in the land, again, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar, king, or to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Remember, we talked about they were a Greek people. There were some colonies there, and they had some city-states, and they were on good terms with Abraham because they had come to some agreements. And it says here in verse 2, the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, I will be with you, I will bless you, for to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. So God is solidifying Isaac's commitment to the land, because he's saying, now my covenant's with you that was with Abraham. And he gives him the same type of promise. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And so Isaac gets this promise, and then the next thing he does is he settles in Gerar, and he tells Abimelech, she is my sister. You know, the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. So it goes a little different. They don't try to, steal her away and marry her, but it says that that one day Abimelech looked out the window and saw Isaac laughing with his wife. The word laughing there, they said, could mean something different. It might mean something, a little romantic. It might mean he was holding her hand and kind of, putting his arm around her and whispering in her ear. It may suggest a little more than, laughing at a joke. Something wasn't right. They're like, that's not brother and sister behavior. And so Abimelech's mad, and he warns the people not to mess with Isaac. And so the rest of the chapter talks about how fruitful Isaac was farming, makes a lot of money farming, and he doesn't want, or Abimelech doesn't want him with him, so he drives him away because he's so much better. God is just blessing him. And then Isaac goes, and there are these wells that Abraham dug. We saw that in some stories a couple of weeks ago, and they've been stopped up. The servants of Abimelech obviously did not want Isaac living close to him. They stopped up these wells, so he digs 2 more wells, and they fight. He digs a 3rd well, and that one, he finally has enough space to live. And so God kind of gives him some living room up around Beersheba. And in verse 24, the Lord appears to him and says, I'm the God of Abraham your father. Fear not, for I am with you and will bless you and multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. So God is blessing Isaac because of an agreement he made with Abraham. And so Isaac does the same thing Abraham does. He builds an altar there in verse 25, and he lives there. And so you see that after that, after God's established him, Abimelech comes up again with the same guy. We talked about Phicol last time, how he has an Anatolian name, which makes us think that these people were Greek, Philistine sea peoples, Mycenaean Greeks. And they make an agreement with Isaac, and and this well they find there at Sheba, Beersheba. Beer means well, and Sheba is the place name. Um, they dig this well and make a feast and just have a great time. And so this is kind of the close of Isaac's story, just for his regular life. Every other story we're going to have about him is going to deal with the two boys, Esau and Jacob. And so the last thing I want to talk about with Isaac this week is the story briefly about him blessing Jacob after Jacob deceives him when Esau's out hunting. Whenever this story, and we're going to get into it more next week, but whenever the story is read, it's not clear exactly what happens. God told Rebekah that the older would serve the younger. Did she never tell Isaac? Did she tell Isaac, Jacob's going to be the leader, not Esau? God told me. And did Isaac reject that? We don't know. We know that sometimes we have plans for our kids. That's not God's plan for our kids. And we need to yield them up to the Lord. But it's still strange what exactly happens here. We don't know exactly. We keep going down into the rest of Genesis, and we just see all this strife and argument between the two brothers, and we wonder, could this have been avoided whenever they were young, if Isaac had taken more of a leadership role? We don't know. The way that Isaac's life goes is when he's 40, he's married. When he's 60, he has the boys. And when he's about, 113 years old, he's lying blind and can't see them anymore very well. But he lives until he's 180 years old. So after he blesses his son, he lives another, 67 years alive while his sons are out, in enmity with each other. In Genesis 35, we have the death of Isaac, and we have it's just briefly mentioned. And so it's also tied in with the story later that we'll get to about the death of Rachel, which was Jacob's favorite wife. So we're in chapter 35. And we're going to skip the part here about the death of Rachel, and we're going to talk about in verse 27. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, remember that from Abraham, or Kiriath Arba, that's Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So we know that at the death of Isaac, Esau and Jacob were together. Like Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham, Esau and Jacob buried him. Now, I didn't talk about this last time during the death of Abraham, but I'm going to talk about it today with the death of Isaac, just because it's a shorter lesson. When it says that Isaac breathed his last and he died and was gathered to his people, we know that expression does not mean he was buried with his people, because it was used of Abraham too, and Abraham was not buried up north in Padan Aram or in Haran or even over in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham was buried by Sarah, his wife. When it says he was gathered to his people, we have to look at this and say there was a very solid belief that life continued after death, that people began a new phase of existence after death. Now, the Old Testament did not spell that out as well as the New Testament. We know glimpses of it in the Psalms. It talks about being with the Lord forever, being in his house forever. But at this point, they had a belief that whenever you passed away, you went to where those who went before you into death went, and it was a gathering to your people, and not much else is talked about with that right now. Um, Interestingly enough, in the next book of the Bible, Exodus, God will say, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jesus uses that to say he's the God of the living. And so there's this very real sense in which in the Old Testament, they knew more than they said. They knew more than was spelled out in detail. The words in Scripture were written a certain way to teach us about the afterlife. And when these characters, when these people pass away in this life, they go to another place. Um, so Isaac, he doesn't have a lot of stories. We see that he's a very faithful guy. He stays in the land, stays in God's promises, and he ends up, dying at a ripe old age and being buried. And um, but we don't have a lot of stories. So one commentary says that the main point of this section of Genesis to show Isaac, um, in one half of the story, he is the beloved son of a great father, Abraham. And in the other part of the story, he is the troubled father of two troubled, or the let's say the passive father of two troubled sons, Jacob and Esau. And so Isaac really is a transition character here to get from Abraham to his notorious grandson, Jacob. Um, and another interesting aspect about this is if you look at the ages of, of all the characters in Genesis, Abraham, passed away last week. We know that he had Isaac when he was 100 years old. If you remember that from the stories, and we know that Abraham lived, here we go here, 175 years old. So there's 75 years of him living with Isaac. Well, Isaac had Jacob and Esau when he was 60 years old. That means there were 15 years, if the math is all adding up right, that Abraham got to sit with Jacob and Esau running around. Just the way Genesis moves, it's interesting because like it leaves characters in place to tell other stories and doesn't go chronologically. But you got to think 15 years that Jacob and Esau were running around, the little campsite with old man Abraham. And so pretty interesting to think about. You've got this whole family tradition of deception. Abraham deceiving people by lying about Sarah, Isaac deceiving by lying about Rebekah, and then Jacob just taking it to a new level. And so you almost wonder, like, as they're sitting here, what was Abraham thinking the last 15 years of his life watching the two boys? Did he know what Rebekah had heard from God? Did he kind of just look at them and say, you know what, this is going to be a mess, but my son's got to deal with it? We don't know. We can just speculate, but it's interesting to add up all the years and say what was going on with this, because, the years overlap, and it wasn't all cut and dry like the narrative puts it here, but that's just the way that the book of Genesis deals with things. It does not deal with it chronologically. It likes to deal with a character, his birth, stories, death, and then kind of work on some other stuff. And of course, there's a lot of overlap with Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, but like I said, that's because Jacob is the second main character of Genesis. So that's all I've got for right now on this. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of questions here that I'm going to attach to an email to my class. And if not, just post in the comments. I can send you one. And I'm not going to read them out or go over them right now because they're pretty easy, and I just want you to think about them yourself. Like, these are discussion questions. And so the next time we have a class, I'm going to go over the discussion questions with you because I just want you to think about some things with the story so far. And so next week, we're going to talk about the birthright, Jacob and Esau. What is going on with this birthright? Because it's a weird story. Selling birthright for a soup and then having to steal it. And then we'll talk about, Jacob and Esau for a while. And then the last character we're going to deal with is Joseph. And so we've got two major sections to go over, Jacob and Esau and Joseph. And then we'll be done with the book of Genesis. So hope that you are enjoying just looking at all of the sorry, I'm trying to get my system working here. Looking at all the stories and all the interweave timelines and everything. I wanted to give you one more thing to think about here, and that is, all right, next week when we talk about Isaac blessing Jacob, I want you to tell me, do you think Isaac knew, or do you think Isaac was really deceived? Was he trying to follow God's plan that maybe his wife told him and just telling his son, oh, sorry, there's nothing I can do about it? Or do you think he was being honest that he was deceived? So basically, was Isaac deceived or was Isaac a deceiver in chapter 27? We'll talk about that next week. So hope you have a good weekend. I miss you all and can't wait till we can be restored back together at church. Until then, let me know in the comments if you want to hear anything else or want me to discuss anything else in more detail. God bless you all. Take care.